Hey there! My name is Jeremiah. Welcome back to UnExamined. Last time we were here, we took a look at socialism and all of the controversies that surround it. This week, I would like for us to take a look at what many believe to be the inevitable follow-up to socialism, Marxist communism. So what is communism? How many countries have tried it? Has it ever succeeded? And what would it look like if it did succeed? These are the questions we'll be answering today in this week's episode of UnExamined. Now, when most people think about communism, they tend to think about this guy, old Big Daddy Marx. But in truth, the core values and beliefs of communism actually go back much, much further. The core beliefs of communism have actually been around as long as philosophy itself. Ancient Greek philosopher Pythagoras taught his followers to live into one building and share all of their belongings amongst each other. Arguably the most famous ancient Greek philosopher, Plato, described what many believe to be a precursor to communism in his most famous work, The Republic. Plato described a system where there was no private property and all labor was run through the government. Now, there is no question that most communists today would look at Plato's ideas and kind of roll their eyes a bit. But there can be no question that Plato was actually one of the first people to question the idea of markets and property. But this isn't the only place that we can see some early form of communism taking shape before Marx comes in. Believe it or not, many people today would actually classify the early Christian church as a forerunner to communism. And while this would make many American Christians shriek in terror, there really isn't any denying it when you take a closer look. In Acts chapter 4, we learn that the Christian church has grown to about 4,000 people thanks to the evangelizing of Peter and John. For a person to become a member of the church, they had to sell all of their worldly belongings, including their own private property and land. And they would use that money and funds to help support the ministry and the community that they lived in. All the believers were in one heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. That there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who had owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. In the very next chapter, we learn of a young couple who brings their offerings before the church, but keeps some of what they had sold for themselves and lie about it to the apostles. This causes them to be immediately struck down dead. And the apostles made this very public knowledge, so that if anyone else tried to do the same thing, they would live in fear. But even before the founding of the church, the teachings of Jesus was quite clearly anti-capitalist. In Luke 14:33, Jesus says, "Those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my followers." Jesus also advocated for paying taxes, had a noted disdain for people who were wealthy, and he had a strong love and made his entire life's work go towards helping the poor and the sick and making sure that they had the care and attention they needed. That's right, boys and girls. Oh, Jesus was a tanky. Now, before we get to the main man himself, there's one more person that we need to talk about pre-Marx who had an undeniable influence on communism. And boy, would I rather not. Hegel! Okay, so for those who've never studied philosophy, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was an annoyingly hard to understand philosopher from the early 1800s who was cherished in his time by people both on the right and the left. Marx himself was heavily influenced by Hegel, so if we're going to understand Marx, we're going to have to crack this guy's nut. Hegel proposed a view of history called the dialectic. And with this theory, he basically summarized that all change throughout human history has occurred in 3 phases. The first stage is thesis. For this stage, someone would come up with an idea or a new belief that challenges the old way in which things are done. This would be where an idea is first proposed or an existing ideology is questioned. This is usually where some form of progress or innovation to society or just invention is introduced. So to come up with a visual image to help us understand this, let's imagine a prehistoric man is carrying around a basket with all of his equipment on his back, but it's wearing him out. So he complains to his friends and he says that, hey, I'm tired of carrying around this basket. I don't want to do it anymore. There's got to be a better way. The second stage is called antithesis. This would be the reactionary response to the thesis that works antagonistically to it. Historically, this is where someone who has a strong value and tradition would oppose the new ideas being presented. So now let's imagine our prehistoric dude has a buddy who's walking beside him. And his buddy goes, hang on a minute. We carry these baskets on our back because we live a nomadic lifestyle. We don't just settle down. If we stop moving, we die. Are you trying to get us all killed? The third and final stage is synthesis. This is where the first two stages compromise and their differences are removed. So now let's imagine that there's a prehistoric woman standing right beside them, and she hears the two guys arguing over whether or not they should be carrying baskets, and she says, hey, what if we did both? What if we put our baskets onto rocks and made the rocks roll? That would take all the strain off of our backs, but we would still keep moving. Does that work? And thus the wheel was invented. Yes, I really did just reinvent the wheel in order to explain Hegel. Sue me. Please don't sue me. I have no money. Hegel believed that this dialectic typically occurred in small, gradual steps, but from time to time that it would take violent, revolutionary leaps and bounds. Okay, so what does this have to do with communism? Well, Marx saw Hegel's dialectic and decided to apply it to economic theory and created a system that he called historical materialism. Historically, our economic system has moved from primitive communism, which was essentially prehistoric tribes working together with no hierarchical powers in which everyone was considered equal as hunter-gatherers, and then moved into slave states. Slave states would exist where there was warring tribes trying to vie for power, and one tribe would enslave the other, and you would have one ruler with complete authority, and the slaves would have no economic power. Slave states would then transition into feudalism. Now, under feudalism, the lower class technically wasn't slaves. Technically. But they were serfs who had to serve their lords and didn't really get a say in the matter. And of course, from feudalism, we transitioned into capitalism, which is what we have today, where more of the power is divided up amongst business owners rather than just a few elite lords. Now, what makes Marx so important even today is that he noticed something special about this transition: its relationship to power. Under primitive communism, everyone shared power fairly equally. And then when you move down into slave states, where certain tribes are taking over other tribes and that power is beginning to become more and more consolidated, and the ones at the bottom have less power, that power is siphoned up. And then as we continue down into feudalism, the same thing continues. More power goes more towards the top with one ruler and direct authority of thousands, if not millions. From the transition from feudalism to capitalism, we see that power shift again, except now it divides itself, and we see more power divided amongst more people, but it's specifically just the wealthy and the landowners. And so here's where Marx picks up. Marx thinks that because of the dialectic, because of the swinging progress of history, that the only natural next step is for that power to end up being divided more amongst the workers. And that's where communism comes in. Marx lived in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and so when he looked around and saw the sweatshops, the child labor, the horrible working conditions that most of the working class were forced to live under, and realized how little economic power the lower and working class still had, he realized that we still had a ways to go. Capitalism had brought us progress, but we still weren't equal. So Marx believed that the next step in the chain would inevitably be socialism, where the power was divided more and more amongst the workers. From there, communism would begin to be developed as a completely equal society, where everyone had equal economic power. I already made a video on socialism, which you can watch here. So let's dive straight into what communism is and what it isn't. So the first thing that we should clarify is that from moving forward from here on out, we're going to be referring to Marxism. Marxism is a specific type of communism, but not all communism is Marxism. Got that out of the way? I don't have to see that comment? Thanks. As we noted before, many iterations of different forms of communism have existed long before old Karl put pen to paper. Broadly, communism is defined as a system in which goods are owned in common and are available to all as needed. Marxism, in simple terms, is more about how you apply communism to society, both politically and economically. Marx's plan was specifically to move from capitalism into socialism and then to move from socialism into communism. This means that a country can be Marxist without being communist. In fact, despite what you may have been taught, no communist country, by definition, has ever existed. This doesn't mean that there haven't been countries that weren't trying to move in that direction. But even the infamous USSR wasn't communist. It was socialist with a planned economy, which means that all of the power of production was in the hands of the state and not the people. The United Soviet Socialist Nations, or USSR or socialists for short, was to this day the most ambitious undertaking of Marxist ideologies in a country. There were undeniably flaws in its execution and leadership. But for those of us living in the US, or any capitalist country for that matter, it's important to recognize that the USSR was considered an enemy. Marxism was considered an enemy to any capitalist nation, not because they were necessarily being overly aggressive to those nations, but because their ideologies on how to run the nation were so conflicted. So that being said, the information we were taught about the USSR inside capitalist countries is going to have been biased and potentially misleading in some situations. So let's just keep that in mind going forward. This is not going to be a video of me defending Stalin or any of the crimes made by the USSR. I'm not here to do that. I'm merely trying to point out that not every issue is as black and white as what we may have been taught. Remember, the entire point of this channel is to make sure that our views aren't going unexamined. Prior to making this video, I myself had many opinions about the USSR that were actually incorrect the more research I did. So, in order to provide you with the best information possible, I'm going to leave all of my sources in the description down below. Feel free to fact check me and leave any comments or questions that you have, and I'll try to respond. I am not here to make one video that changes the way you look at the world. My purpose is to simply make you question existing beliefs and make sure that you're reaching the beliefs that you do have in your own free will and not by something that's been programmed into you. Whatever you choose to believe here forward, that's up to you. But I just want to make sure you have the resources available to you to do that. So if we're going to learn about the USSR, it would probably be helpful to learn a little bit about the history of Russia leading up to its formation. This will give us a clear picture of exactly why the USSR was so ambitious and impressive in the success that it did have. Most European nations had developed some form of democracy, had improved the quality of life of their citizens, and had begun to industrialize and innovate at a startling pace. Russia, however, existed as what was basically a feudalistic society, with all the power being siphoned up directly to the top and being in the hands of an elite few. The most powerful of whom was Tsar Nicholas II, Russia's autocratic leader who functioned essentially as an all-powerful king. Most of the country's laborers at the time were called serfs, and were essentially slaves and had no economic power whatsoever. And most of the country's grains and goods were being exported out to other nations, causing thousands to die from hunger. The Tsar's leadership was highly criticized amongst the people, even though he had created a secret police specifically to quell down protests. They happened all the same. Russia began to suffer devastating losses, both to Japan and Germany. So in 1917, the Russian Revolution began. On International Women's Day, what started out as a simple protest led by some amazing women who were protesting to get more food put on the table of their families ended up blowing up into this massive nationwide protest. Soldiers were asked to fire on these protesters, would instead turn around and help the protesters overthrow the government that they were trying to protect. In what would likely be the most turbulent 5 years in the nation's entire history, the nation ended up going from a backwater, feudalistic country into a shaky, loose democracy, spiraling into a full-fledged civil war that cost thousands of lives, and eventually reached the formation of the infamous USSR. Because of all the violence and death, Russia seemed to be in this position that would cripple pretty much any nation and wouldn't really be recoverable. Nonetheless, this broken and demolished nation managed to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, so to speak, and were able to completely turn their country around in the course of only 3 decades, eventually becoming the largest economic power in the world next to the US. One of the most common insults hurled at socialism, communism, Marxism, etc., seems to be that it stifles innovation. But this doesn't actually seem to be the case. Despite the US having an astronomically large start in both industry and technology, the USSR was able to come from dead last in order to beat the US in almost every single benchmark in the space race, from getting the first satellite to orbit to getting the first man and woman into space. In fact, the only milestone of the space race that the US was able to beat the USSR was landing someone on the moon. You know, it's actually pretty ironic. In the fight between capitalism versus communism over a battle of space to see who's the more superior, both states ended up using neither of those programs and actually ended up using socialism, the middle ground, with socially funded programs in order to accelerate the space race. So saying that socially funded programs seems to stifle innovation actually seems to be the opposite of true. And the technological advancements of socialism doesn't really just stop with rockets going up into space. Pretty much all the technology available to us in our world today is available thanks to socially funded programs through the government. Whether it's internet, GPS, cell phones, microchips, Google, social media, satellites, all of that was researched and achieved through socially funded programs and was not discovered by a capitalist investor. Socialism would discover the technology, and then a capitalist investor would come up and buy it so that they could sell it for a profit. This means is that what often happens is your taxpayer dollars ends up going into funneling a research project that ends up being sold back to you, despite the fact that you're the one who paid for it to be made in the first place. Another area that I myself was sorely misinformed about was the USSR's ability to feed its people. I'm sure you've probably heard before, if anyone ever describes themselves as being pro-socialism or communism, that someone else will come along and quip, "Oh, well, you just must love waiting in bread lines." But it doesn't take much examination to realize that this myth is, well, it's a myth. Any old pictures that you might see that shows people waiting in lines for bread, often, if you take a close look at those pictures, you might quickly realize that that is coming directly from the Great Depression, a time in which everybody was waiting for food and starving. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that the USSR was founded in 1922, immediately after they had suffered multiple famines and multiple wars in which they lost thousands and thousands of lives from both. Yeah, their food production was going to be a bit short. Then, a few years later, once they finally started to get stable, the Great Depression hit, which was caused by capitalism, and it affected the entire world. So, yeah, there was some hunger issues at the start of it. That's pretty undeniable, but when you examine why, kind of makes sense. It wouldn't have mattered if it was capitalist, communist, or feudalistic. No matter what type of system you had, there was going to be hunger problems. Yeah, okay, but the USSR lasted until the 90s, so how exactly did they fare when it was normal time? Weren't they waiting for food then too? Well, yeah, communists definitely were eating less. A study conducted from 1978 to 1980 discovered that Americans were eating at about 3,500 calories a day, while the poor and impoverished communist nation were eating on average... That can't be right. 3,280 calories a day, with average difference of only 240 calories, which is like a Pop-Tart. So communists essentially had one less Pop-Tart a day, and I don't know about you, but I could probably stand to cut down on my Pop-Tarts, so I think it's fine, honestly. Good job, communists. You kept everybody fed. All jokes aside, it's worth pointing out that the USSR was able to provide food for all of its citizens. In contrast, 1 in 10 Americans struggle to put food on the table. And before you ask, this study isn't based on some hippy-dippy findings at a university that's super pro-Marxist. This study was made by the CIA. These guys literally have a career of trying to make Marxists look as bad as possible. It's like their thing. I'll make a video about it later. Just Trust me, or do your own research. I can't do everything. Remember, the CIA had just gotten out of war with these guys. Like, their entire job during the Cold War was to try and make the USSR look as bad as possible. So for them to do this study and find kind of the opposite of the information they wanted doesn't bode well. Worldwide, around 9 million people die every single year from hunger. And this isn't because we don't have enough food. Especially in wealthy capitalist nations, we throw away more food than we eat. And we have more than enough food produced every single year to feed every man, woman, and child the nutrition requirements that they need, and then some, all over the world. And yet, even in our own nations, we can't keep people fed. This would not happen under a Marxist economy. Under capitalism, however, this is allowed to happen. Because for one thing, it's not profitable to give these people food if it doesn't give you anything in return. The sole goal of capitalism is profit. Additionally, it serves as an incentive. As horrible as it is to say, for capitalists to survive, there has to be poor people. Because if there's not poor people, there will be no one to work their jobs. And so it's in the capitalists' interests to have their laborers always afraid of starvation in order to work for them. There should be no denial that the USSR did have problems. I'm not here to say that the USSR was some perfect, great nation that everybody loved and nobody was ever upset about. That wouldn't be true, and that's not what I'm here to do. But when we examine what the problems with the USSR were, then it becomes pretty clear that those problems came from the leadership itself, not from the ideology of the society. Stalin was an authoritarian figure who did not specifically idealize and represent what the actual spirit of Marxism is. And Lenin wasn't perfect either. And I'm sure saying that I might catch some flack in the comments from Stalinists or Leninists who do choose to support them today, but I don't care. I don't agree with what they did. Period. This video is not meant to justify any of the atrocities committed by the USSR or specifically by Stalin. But it's important to recognize that just because Stalin was a socialist, that doesn't mean that all socialism is going to look like him. It's also worth pointing out that there have been plenty of capitalist dictators who fall on the alt-right, who did commit plenty of atrocities. To illustrate this point, let's look at the political graph again real quick. Now, I know that this example isn't perfect. There's going to be some flaws with it, but just follow through with me so that I can explain this as best as I possibly can, as simply as I possibly can. So on the political graph, Stalin is rated up in the top left quadrant. Most people on the left, whether it's socialists, Marxists, communists, anarchists, actually fall more on the libertarian quadrant. In order to compare and contrast, let's take a look at where Joe Biden and Hitler fall on the same exact graph. As you can see, Joe Biden and Hitler are in the exact same quadrant. They're not even realistically that far away from each other when you take the comparison. Now, they're by no means the same in most of their political beliefs, but when you structure their beliefs out into a system, it falls under the same category. Does that make sense? So when you compare Stalin to most modern Marxists, you're making this big of a gap. That's huge. It's not comparable. Most Marxists today advocate for a much more libertarian society where the power isn't in the hands of the state, but it's in the hands of the workers, the proletariat. The form of government ran in the USSR, commonly referred to as Stalinism, is vastly different from what most Marxists, socialists, anarchists, and everyone else wants today. And it's just important to keep that in mind. And it's also important to recognize that besides the USSR, we've seen several socialist success stories in countries all over the world with democratically elected socialists who were later overthrown by US interference, a topic which deserves its complete own video. So when we look at this objectively, we should recognize the flaws and the mistakes of socialism and Marxism in the past and try and move forward past them. Capitalism has failed in many, many countries all across the world. And if we're being honest, it's failed in the US too. What would you call the Great Depressions, the Great Recession of the housing collapse, the coronavirus collapse? What would you call all of these, if not a failure of capitalism? So to say that Marxism always fails would be no more intellectually honest than to say that capitalism always fails. Marxism has historically failed because capitalism intervenes. Because if Marxism was to succeed, then capitalism would no longer seem appealing to all of the people that it exploits. So how do we do it? How do we get from capitalism to communism? Well, one of the primary lessons that we can take away from the USSR is that when we rush into Marxism, we seem to get a less stable government that's more prone to authoritarian tendencies. Herbert Marcuse, one of the most renowned members of the Frankfurt School and a prominent German-American philosopher, strongly believed that in order for Marxism to work, it had to take place over the course of several generations. Marcuse believed that any society that immediately tried to switch itself over from capitalism on one day into Marxist socialism the next day would automatically be doomed to fail. After all, the transition from feudalism to capitalism took place over the course of several hundred years as well. One of the flaws of Marxist communism that people like to throw out is that it incentivizes laziness, that it conflicts with human nature. They say that communism rewards people for doing the bare minimum and provides no incentives for moving up in society. However, what these people are calling human nature, Marcuse would not call this a natural behavior. Instead, he would say that it's something that's been programmed into us by capitalism. According to Marcuse, everyone in society is always shifting between one of two roles. You're either being a worker or you're being a consumer. As a worker is where you go to work and spend most of your life working for a wage so that when you return home, you can be a consumer. Consumer here means not just consuming food, but also consuming media, entertainment, products, anything that you can think of that you're out there purchasing and trying to get for yourself, that's what you're consuming. So under communism, if we were to take a radical shift away from capitalism into communism, Marcuse believed that what we would experience is that people would automatically try to fill the void left from capitalism with more consuming, because they've been programmed to be in one state or the other. So when you remove the working, they automatically try to replace it and overcompensate by consuming more than they need. This is the human nature argument in a nutshell. Now, there's many other ways that you can address that argument, but to me, this is one of the most undeniable ones. So to Marcuse, the solution to the human nature problem isn't that communism doesn't work, but is to say that in order for us to get out of the mindset of having to either be a worker or consumer, that it might take a few generations to transition away from the capitalistic mindset. It would be smaller changes at first. You might see workers start working only 4 days a week rather than the 5 40-hour work week that we are considered standard today. From there, workers could kind of organize all businesses into forms of co-ops where all forms of business are run democratically and workers are given power over their own business, thereby controlling the means of production. This wouldn't disrupt competition between businesses, but it would allow workers to set their own wages, benefits, and gradually decrease the amount of hours required for them to work. What we would eventually begin to see is that these businesses would no longer need to compete and they would begin to funnel resources together. And because of that, we would start to see higher quality products that are being produced at a higher productivity while still being democratically run, allowing the workers to decide best how to pursue profits, innovations, and new market research. After this, there would be a massive push to allow for all businesses to be run as autonomously as possible. Under capitalism, automation is something that most people are concerned about. As we look forward to the future, it's predicted that 70% of jobs will be able to be replaced by artificial intelligence within about the next 30 years. This means that as capitalism continues to advance, 70% of the job market is not going to be available to anyone. Under Marxist communism, however, this would actually be a welcome change. Because what this means is that the more the market becomes automated, the less time people are required to work in order to produce for the community. This means that if your job is completely run by machines, then there's no need for you to even have to work, eventually allowing for us to get to a point where we're a labor-free society, but still having all of our needs met. Now that's much further down the road than I could predict on a simple roadmap here, but that's kind of where we're aiming. The goal of a Marxist society is to create as equal of a society as possible. And neo-Marxists and current and modern leftists kind of envision this way of thinking as allowing society and technology to advance as much as possible so that we're not required to break our backs in some factory or at some office desk in a cubicle somewhere in order to make ends meet. We want as comfortable and as high a quality of life as possible for everyone. And that's the goal. This would allow people to spend more time with their families, with their loved ones, their friends, out in their community, bonding and finding new ways to interact, as well as to pursue their own interests like art and creativity and entertainment, travel even. It may sound kind of obvious, but under a Marxist economy, communities are a much bigger focus. Under capitalism, we all tend to see each other as competitors. Even if we don't necessarily think about it, it's how we're programmed. When you go to work, if you're wanting to get a promotion, you have to overcome everyone else on your same work level in order to get that promotion, which means you're competing against them. But under Marxism, we're allowed to see each other in a different way. We see each other as a community, as a family, and it allows us not to work necessarily in the competition of each other, but in the interests of each other. What helps you in communism helps me as well. What's good for one of us is good for all of us. So under Marxism, we go from seeing each other as competitors to comrades. This government would also be required to make sure that all of your basic necessities are taken care of. Housing, healthcare, education, transportation, basic amenities like power and water, food, all of these are things that would be guaranteed to you under a communist country. This means that yes, you would have a higher percentage of the earnings of the market being put into the state directly, but this also means that you wouldn't have to stress to worry about whether or not you were putting food on the table for your children. And notice there that I said that the profits of the market, because the way this could run is rather than taking taxes directly from you, since all businesses are being run democratically now, you could decide to have all the state funding go directly through the businesses rather than from what you earn. This means as a libertarian, you wouldn't be taxed, but the businesses would, and you would be able to spend whatever money you earn on whatever commodities are available for purchase. Your needs would be met, and everything else that you want to do is what you're free to do for yourself. And it's also worth pointing out that under a system where everyone has a higher education, this means that everyone is as well informed as possible about what society needs in order to advance. We all have a high understanding of the different technicalities of the market and how best to move ourselves forward. This doesn't mean that there wouldn't be some people who were uneducated. I mean, even today, as much information as we have available, we do still have people who push anti-vaxxer theories, flat earth theories, and anti-climate denial theories that are all incredibly stupid and very hard to even grapple with the fact that they're real and in this world. But they are. So it's very likely that even under a Marxist economy, we would still have just as many of these conspiracy theories that need to be addressed. But the more educated a population is, the less need there is for hierarchy. You would go from needing 20 managers to run a business to only needing one to make sure that business is just kind of flowing in the right direction. And that manager would be elected democratically in the workplace. So it's not like he came from outside where some corporate office decided who was going to be in charge of you, but you actually had a vote and a voice in it. It's also worth pointing out that most crime comes from poverty. So if there is no poverty, then it's reasonable to say that most crime would disappear overnight. Crime tends to happen when people are driven to desperation in order to survive. And our tough on crime mentality here in the United States is actually incredibly harmful towards creating productive citizens who can contribute to society. So under capitalism, it becomes a much much worse feedback loop. All of that's to say that Marxism, as great as it is, would probably still have flaws. And the reason for this is because we're humans, and boy, are we flawed. But the truth of it is that we're also pretty great. When you look at history and just look at how far humanity has come, both with technology and ethical progress, it's absolutely amazing to see just how far we've come in a few thousand years. Our short span of existence next to the rest of the history of this planet is incredible. We've done so much in such a short amount of time. But in order for us to continue to do well, I truly believe that we need to continue to do the most essential and necessary thing for all life, and that is to adapt and to grow. The wheel of progress doesn't stop moving, and I believe that if we ever do reach a time where we become a fully communist society, that there will be a next step after that, and probably another one after that. Progress moves ever forward. I don't think there will ever be a time where we just arrive and don't have any more progress to make. Those changes aren't things that we can imagine currently, but it's worth considering. I believe there will come a time in the future where people look back at capitalism with the same kind of snickers and disregard as we look at feudalism. And if we survive long enough and continue to adapt and evolve, Marxism will probably end up getting snickered at too by some next step on the evolutionary change of economics. Like I said, the main thing to keep in mind is that humanity has spent its entire lifetime advancing over thousands of years. So to think that we've arrived and that this is some endpoint and we're never going to go any further, it's egotistical and it's not very realistic. We've got to continue to grow and we've got to continue to move forward. So before we conclude, there is one thing that I want to address. If you look at everything that I've suggested today and talked about, and you say, you know what, Jeremiah, that just seems idealistic and utopian, I just want you to think about the fact that at one point in time, capitalism would have seemed the same way to the servants who lived under feudalism. You know, everything that I've suggested and talked about here is realistic. Like, it's happened. We've documented most of these policies being successful in the real world and sustainable. We know for a fact that we have enough food to feed everyone on the planet and then some. We know for a fact that healthcare, education, and housing are all basic human rights and that we can provide them for everyone and that is a sustainable system. Hundreds of years ago, that would have seemed impossible, but now we know better. We also know that if everyone in society was working and that we used automation as much as possible, that work requirements would go down and people would have more and more free time to spend with their loved ones, which would make everyone more productive and happy. We know for a fact that there's enough resources on the planet to raise the quality of life for everyone. These are all just facts. So I don't think it should be very controversial to say that most Americans would be satisfied living in a world where all of our health care, our housing, our education, our food needs are met and guaranteed. I don't think it's controversial to say that most of us would rather spend time with the people we love than spend it slaving away at some job. And lastly, I would hope that it's not controversial for us to want to leave a better planet and a better system of government and economics for our children and for our grandchildren so that they can have these things that we're talking about today. I'm not here to sell you something. There are so many different variations of Marxism and different ways that it can be applied and discussed, and I'm sure there will be people in the comments talking about how I didn't perfectly represent one form or another, and to those folks, I'm sorry. I'm sure you'll comment and let everybody know what details I might have missed, and that's fine. I encourage that. I'm not perfect. I don't have all the information here. In fact, for those of you who are still skeptical, I don't want this to be the video that wins you over. Truly. I want this to be a starting point. I want you to be challenged by what I've said. I want you to go through my sources and try and contradict any of the things that I've said. I want you to make your own decisions, because to me, it's so much more valuable for you to come to your own conclusions than for me to program them into you. And to me, our society has a tendency to program certain beliefs and ideas into us, so I would much rather take the opposite approach and allow you to reach things yourselves. Capitalism has made demonizing communism into a literal art form. So it's important to recognize that anything that you've been taught about communism under capitalist guidance may not be the best representation of it. So I just ask that you keep that in mind and try and make your own decisions. And if at the end of the day you decide that you're still not sure about communism, I'm okay with it, just as long as you're more informed. But just to get you started, I'll link a couple videos in the description below of some other creators who helped me while researching this video. They've got some incredible content, much better than I could probably ever put out, and they're definitely worth giving a look to see what they have to say. When I first began writing this episode, I actually had an entirely different script in mind. There were several things about the USSR that I was going to be much more critical of, and there was other things about communism that I planned on talking on, and I just had no intention of this being mostly an episode about the history of communism. But as I did my research and as I continued to study and try and learn about what I was making for this video, I realized that there was some beliefs that I had that needed to be updated and reinformed, that I needed to make sure some of the things in my life didn't go unexamined. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to make sure that I do this. I'm still learning too, and making these videos to try and be as informative and educational for you as possible keeps me on my toes and makes sure that I'm not putting any BS out there. So this video has been a part of a series. The first part was on socialism. Our next video will be about anarchy. No, but seriously, anarchy is a system of beliefs that has become widely misrepresented in our society, and I definitely think is worth taking a look at to see what we can find out about it. Thank you so much for making it this far in the video. I really hope you enjoyed the content and got something out of it. If you have any questions or thoughts on communism and Marxism, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Leaving a comment definitely helps that algorithm, if you know what I mean. And of course, if you could do the whole YouTube thing, like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell. I know everybody asks you to do that, but I've got like 40 subscribers at time of recording this, so every little bit helps tremendously, more than you could know. And since we are still so small, it would mean the world to me if you could just share this with as many of your friends as possible, and try and help promote the channel if you enjoy the content. Otherwise, hey, let me know. Leave a dislike. I understand. Thank you guys so much for watching again. I hope you have a great holiday. And as always, be good to each other, be good to yourselves, and always keep asking questions.